Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the 13th meeting in 2014 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I welcome members and our witnesses and guests in the gallery. And I can remind everyone, please do turn off or at least turn to silent all mobile phones and other electrical devices so they don't interfere with the sound equipment. We have apologies this morning from Richard Baker, MSP. Item 1 on our agenda is a continuation of our inquiry into Scotland's economic future post-2014. And I'd like to welcome the panel joining us this morning to discuss energy policy and specifically renewables. We're joined by Dr. David Toke, who is Reader in Energy Politics, University of Aberdeen. Dr. Nicola McEwen, who's Co-Director of the Institute of Governance, University of Edinburgh. Martin McAdam, Chief Executive Officer of Aquamarine Power. And Eric McKeels, who is Chief Executive of Infinis Energy plc. Welcome to you all. And now we all have your written evidence. Thank you very much for that. It's very helpful in terms of framing the discussion. In view of that, and in view of the fact we've got quite a large panel, I'm not going to ask you to make opening statements, but rather go straight into questions. We've got about 90 minutes or so available, so I think that should give us time to explore the issues and the issues in your submissions. I would just say to members, even though we have some time in hand, we'd be grateful if we could keep questions short and to the point, and similarly answers as short and to the point as possible would be very helpful. And rather than have members ask questions to all 4 panel members, which will mean it will take a lot of time to get through the topics, I would ask members if they could direct their questions initially at one panel member. But if you would then like to come in and respond to a point that somebody else has made, if you just catch my eye, I will bring you in as best I can as time allows. I wonder if I could start off by asking a question first to you, Nicola McEwen, and then if the others want to respond to that, please come in and do so. And it's really picking up on something that's in your submission, Dr. McEwen, about what the white paper says about the ambition of the Scottish Government for a continuation of close working arrangements between the Scottish Government and the rest of the UK Government in the event of a yes vote in independence, and specifically the ambition in the white paper that there need to be a far greater degree of oversight of the market arrangements for energy and firmer safeguards over Scottish energy security than we currently have. Now, I think it's clear to most observers, but we're starting to see a growing divergence in terms of energy policy between UK and Scotland. For example, UK has now approved 1 new nuclear power station, and there may be many more. At a UK level, the Conservative part of the coalition has expressed its ambition to scale back on support for onshore wind. Certainly, whereas in Scotland, the SNP government is still very committed to its ambitious renewables targets. Given that there's divergence in energy policy, how credible do you think it is that there can be this detailed, integrated energy market in the event of a yes vote?
I think in terms of a common trading market, I don't see a problem at all. And if you look to the examples of the Nordic states, I mean, when I was doing interviews over there, one of the things that came through in a number of interviews was that it was the complementarity, the differences between the Nordic countries in terms of their energy supply that made the common market make more sense, because they complemented each other because of their differences. So in terms of trade, I don't necessarily see a problem. In terms of policy, I think that's much more difficult to envisage. And there wasn't a lot of detail in the white paper about what a strategic energy partnership would look like. So it's not altogether clear at the moment, I don't think, about how that would develop and what exactly is envisaged there. But if we take, say, a problem or a perceived problem with the current system, so one of the frustrations of the Scottish Government has been, say, around the transmission charging regime. Okay, I find it difficult to envisage how you would be able to have very different charging regimes within such a tightly integrated market. So if the idea is that with independence you have greater influence over the nature of the UK market, then I struggle to see how that would take place as envisaged within a strategic energy partnership. There might be some ways to circumvent it within Scotland, doing something differently and supplementary within Scotland, but to actually change the nature of the market throughout the UK, I find that more difficult to envisage.
I'll bring you in a second, Dr. Tote. I just want to follow up one point with Dr. McEwen. To what extent would, post-independence, the rest of the UK rely on Scotland for its energy needs, or other options the rest of the UK could pursue?
There's a lot of debate and contingencies within that. I mean, if all of the offshore wind happened in the way that people would like it to, or the promises have suggested, then perhaps not quite so much. If all of the interconnections go ahead with the rest of Europe, then perhaps not quite so much. But I think that there will be a continuing, probably expanding energy demand in the whole of the UK. And if, as the UK moves towards electrification, if you like, in transport and heat, if that's the long-term view from the Climate Change Act, then of course there will be demand. It was interesting to note that the Republic of Ireland was often mooted as an alternative source for meeting at least some of that demand. Now, some of the ideas and aspirations around sourcing electricity directly from the Republic of Ireland have just fallen through, at least for the time being. So that suggests that there would be a market there, certainly, for Scotland to export to. But I think in terms of the overall need, then it's always going to be a relatively small part, but nonetheless an important part, I think.
You were trying to come in, and then I'll see if the others want to come in and comment on this. Yeah.
It's quite clear to me what's likely to happen in the event of independence, in that after 2020, because I think things would probably remain much the same as they are now until 2020 for various reasons, which I'll expand upon if you want to ask me. But after 2020, I think what we'll get is that Scotland will have its own regulatory system for electricity, its own incentive system for whatever new energy sources it wants, but there'll be a common system operator. I think you have to make these important distinctions. And the common system operator will guarantee energy security on the basis of the whole of the capacity in the GB for both the rest of the UK and Scotland. It's very clearly in both parties' interest, Scotland and the rest of the UK, for there to be a common system operator, and it would not be particularly novel for there to be a common system operator between states with different regulatory regimes. There exists one in the United States which covers 13 Midwest states with different regulatory systems, and the Canadian state of Manitoba. And I think if you read between the lines of the British government's submission, despite their a lot of hand-waving, they would they're ready to go along with that because it suits both parties' interests. The rest of the UK doesn't want to have to manage incoming, otherwise uncontrolled bursts of variable renewable energy. Scotland still has actually considerable conventional capacity, as the Scottish Government has pointed out. And on the other hand, as Scotland for the future, as it can rely much more solely on renewable energy in the long-term future, and it can share capacity and system security with the rest of the UK. But after 2020, it will have to pay for its own new renewable energy. But in order to reach the target, it will have a much smaller hill to climb compared to what has been in the past, because by 2020, maybe 80% of Scotland's renewable energy target will have been fulfilled. And this mainly by onshore wind as well. It's quite good that Beatrice is being funded, and the British government will pay for that. Great, but you know, Scotland will be able to meet its targets under its own resources without excessive price increases.
I'll bring the others in as well if they want to comment. Martin McAdam, do you want to say anything about this?
Yes, Chairman, thank you. A couple of points just to make in relation to having a single market. I think it's very important. You do have, as both the previous speakers have said, very successful operating single markets. And indeed, quite a recent one is in the island of Ireland, where you have an all-Ireland energy market. So you have two different states, you have two different transmission operators, you have a single market operator for the whole of the island. So you can have different energy policies and yet quite a successful energy market. The other point I'd like to make is that I find it, you know, if we're going out into the marketplace to buy a product, then we will look across all of the potential suppliers for that product. And I think that Scotland has a great product. The good news is that in terms of the commercial viability of wind in particular, on onshore wind, let's take that as an example, Scotland has huge advantages. The fact is that because the wind is so much stronger here, we will be competitive on a like-for-like basis with the rest of the UK. And I think that that's very important to remember, because in an all-island or all-UK market, the suppliers are going to have a distinct advantage in Scotland, and I think that that is something that will remain. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, McKeel.
Yes, perhaps just adding to that point, the reason why we as a private investor in long-term generation infrastructure find doing business in Scotland so attractive is that you have the unique combination of a government which has signed up to very visionary and challenging targets, and given the fact that we invest for the long term, we need a stable framework with full government buy-in to those long-term targets. So that sort of bold challenge that the Scottish government has signed up to, we find very motivating as an investor in long-term capacity. Two, clearly the benefits of a fully integrated UK energy market, as has been indicated by Nicola, Dave and Martin, is undeniable. The reality is that the reason why the energy market is better on an integrated basis is that the two are incredibly interdependent. The UK, or let's say UK without Scotland, cannot produce the same levels of renewable power required to meet or comply with its 2020 binding EU targets. And given the predominance of the household affordability argument these days, as Martin has just said, there's no cheaper renewable power available today than onshore wind power, and especially Scottish onshore wind power. It's the lowest cost per megawatt hour on a life cycle basis. Yeah. So the three combined, I think, make a very powerful argument for the markets to continue to operate on an integrated basis.
Just to follow that up, if I can, I mean, the integrated energy market, therefore, is very important as far as your business is concerned. What therefore needs to be done, if there is a yes vote in the referendum, what needs to be done about providing the assurance that your company and your investors are going to need about future investment in Scotland?
Essentially, we need two grown-up governments that sit together and agree on a long-term plan for the management of the continued integrated nature of that market for the benefits of both countries. Because the UK, Scotland exports today about 25% of its electricity production, and the obvious client is the UK market. So, and the UK can't comply with its 2020 targets without Scottish renewable power. So the interdependency is very strong, and we assume that even in a yes vote, the benefits and interests for both are to sit together and agree on a continued integrated market model.
Yeah.
Chairman, I think the other point to add to that is that a lot of the all of the renewable energy that has been constructed in Scotland, it is currently supported, or the bulk of it supported under the Renewable Obligation Certificate Scheme. And in order to be a supplier of electricity throughout the whole of the UK, you actually have to comply with your obligations under the renewable obligation. That's why it's called renewable obligation. And that won't disappear even in the event of a yes vote, so that we can see there will be a continuation of the demand, as Dr. Toke said, right up until the next period, which is around 2020. There will be a continuation of the need, and those long-term contracts are already in place for the renewable obligations. I think the other point to add is that if we look at the broader European context, one of the goals there is to achieve greater levels of market integration, and greater levels of market integration are dependent on physical integration. Now, we do already have the physical integration between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and if we want to have competition on a European level, which I think is also quite important, then the concept of having or breaking up the electricity market makes no sense whatsoever. I think as a whole, the electricity market makes a lot of sense, combining both Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Okay, I'll bring in Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I think there's a general agreement that, I suppose, for future energy, we need to be looking forward and looking at alternative sources. I mean, earlier this week we were at Aberdeen, wonderful university, Dr. Toke. It was absolutely fantastic venue. And we were talking to a sector from the oil and gas. And although we've got maybe 50, 60, maybe even 70 years left of the oil and gas, we need to project forward at alternative sources. And maybe I could direct my question to Eric. When we were in Aberdeen, one of the barriers they had put for the oil and gas industry in terms of future investment was fiscal stability in terms of taxation, etc., from the UK government. And it seemed that I think there was a general consensus that from the white paper that there was a more acceptance that there would be better fiscal stability for the future. What are the barriers at the moment for your industry in terms of stability? Is it the EMR in terms of future investment?
I think that EMR creates uncertainty because most of the renewable investors for the past decade have grown very familiar with the very effective mechanisms of the RO. Yeah, and as Martin indicated, one of the strong points of the RO is that it created an obligation on behalf of suppliers to source a minimum amount of renewable power. That obligation falls away under the new regime. And that creates all sorts of risks for renewable generators like us who do not have a supply business, because it means that as we don't sell directly to end users, we need to find an intermediary supplier who's willing to take our power. Given the fact that our power is intermittent in nature, we will typically pay a discount to the prevailing wholesale power price. And the question is, under the obligation, under the RO, the existence of the obligation created a market for a steady quantity of wanted renewable power. And we're not certain that will prevail under the new contract for difference regime. So there's an element of uncertainty of moving into new territory. We're not suggesting that CFD is not workable, but given the haste with which Ofgem and DEC are moving ahead in totally unknown territory, given the billions of investment that ultimately rely on private companies understanding the ramifications of the new support regime, this creates a lot of sort of nervousness at the moment, at the time when ultimately it is shareholders of these organizations that need to approve investment that will only yield returns often over, 10, 15 years. And that's the sort of nervousness that's currently going through the industry. The fact that you have certain parties which then whip up sentiment by quite surprisingly suggesting that onshore wind, which is the lowest cost renewable should no longer be taken into consideration at the time when everybody's focusing on affordability for households is very surprising and adds, unfortunately, to that uncertainty.
And you would agree that in terms of the future, we need this renewable energy. There needs to be a mix, and both onshore and offshore in terms of wind and wave energy as well. So taking it forward, post-referendum and the 19th of September, what would you be asking a Scottish government post-independence in the yes vote in terms of giving you that stability you require?
So, we would be very keen to clarify to any government who has the type of ambitious long-term strategic objectives that the Scottish Government has laid out in terms of transitioning towards a low-carbon economy, how we, who are the ultimate capital risk takers, would need to be convinced to carry on with our investment plans. And those fall under two very simple preconditions. The one is clarity around the revenue support regime, whether that's RO or CFD. And the second one is assurances that the Scottish Government would work hand in hand with the UK Government to secure the continuity of the integrated energy market.
Of course, the energy market as well, the renewable sector will provide opportunities for jobs and skills.
Exactly right.
Okay. Any other panel members wish to comment?
Martin?
No,
sorry. Dr. Yeah.
Well, my comment, I would agree with everything he said, but my comment is, well, why is nobody thinking of the still possibility that there will be a no vote?
But I'm just looking at the post-referendum in terms of if there were to be a yes vote, what will you be looking for from a Scottish Government? And then I would probably ask to balance the argument is in the event of that no vote, what would you be looking for? So,
well, I would hope that we wouldn't be just carrying on with business as usual, because I don't think that's very adequate for reasons that have already been discussed. But also, as we go into the 2020s, you'll find that the amount of money spent by the UK as a whole on renewable energy will be falling quite dramatically for various reasons, Conservatives and nuclear power and whatever else. So Scotland has lost the admittedly relatively small control over the RO that it had, but it could send signals as well as do real things with that. And I think in the context of what is likely to be a narrow vote, it would be in a strong position to push for some real control over incentives. And I've commented about how this might be done, to be spent in Scotland, so that if the English want to spend money on nuclear power, well, okay, that's their problem, but...
Everybody's problem. Everything's nuclear.
Yes, sure. Sure, but in terms of the financial allocation, Scotland is almost 1/3 of the British landmass. It therefore commands a similar proportion of renewable energy resources. It ought to have control, therefore, over 1/3 of the incentives that are paid for by the whole of the UK over that are going to be devoted to low-carbon energy sources. I think that is a position which you must start from. And it should have its own control over the regulatory system, so that, for instance, it can get the networks, the distribution operators, to take preemptive decisions about investing in upgrading the networks, so that, for instance, a lot of people who want to organise community renewable schemes can get going much more effectively, as well as everybody in the mainstream renewables industry. And I think let's make some plans for that possibility as well.
Martin McCallum, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I wouldn't say I'm at all a policy expert, but I think when you're formulating policy, particularly in relation to energy, you have to look at things like security of supply, stability, the environment, the lowest cost possibilities, the additional value add in terms of economic activity that can be created. And then, of course, there's a political dimension. And I suppose that when you're in a room where you have investors who are looking to invest in energy within the UK, and in particular within the electricity market in the UK, they're struggling in relation to understanding what energy policy is. And I think that's the biggest challenge. We said it earlier. I mean, what do investors want? If you're investing in renewable assets, you're looking at assets which have a 20 to 25-year lifetime. If you're investing in thermal assets, it's up to 40 years, nuclear assets up to 60 years. So I don't think that the energy policy that we've had has, contributed positively, certainly in the last 10 years or so, to the ability for investors to get comfortable. I think the biggest challenge, what drives energy policy is, I think it's probably unfair to criticize all politicians, but the fact is it seems to be like political expediency. Therefore, we don't like renewables and they get such a bad press and they hamper our potential re-election, so therefore we'll go down a nuclear path. But that, in effect, doesn't actually contribute to the level of economic activity. It certainly doesn't contribute to lowest cost. And then you end up with a policy which people actually don't understand anymore. And I think we have to be very careful. As somebody who's worked in the nuclear industry, I'm not in any way anti-nuclear. I do believe that the energy mix is incredibly important for us. But to say that we have cheap nuclear energy is a myth, and why that's continuing to be propagated. And the benefits of this are the Chinese debt providers and the French technology providers. It doesn't join up in terms of the objectives of what one would hope one gets from a sensible energy policy.
No, I just wanted to follow up one point that Eric McKeel's made. I'm not going to respond to your point about nuclear power because that'll take us down a whole different route.
You're right.
But I wanted to. Right, we won't go there. Right, I wanted to pick up a point Eric McKeel's made, and then bring in Mike McKenzie because he's got a follow up as well. But I was very interested in the point you just made a moment ago, Eric, and you said you talked about the haste of movement by DEC. Now, one of the complaints we hear a lot about EMR is it's been too slow. But you seem to be suggesting the opposite.
So I think there are two things which are important to understand. And given the fact that Infinis, as the largest independent renewable generator in the UK, is involved in all the consultations, we have a privileged sort of witnessing position. So you're absolutely right that to the gestation period for the EMR at sort of Westminster Parliament statute level, took very long. This was a 3 to 4 year process, and the bill finally had royal assent back in December. But when you see what's happened since, to turn that sort of primary legislation into actual workable legislation, how are you going to set the CFD strike price? How are you going to create the payment mechanisms, etc.? CFD is a totally new ballpark in terms of dealing with the challenges of a revenue support regime which has never been tested in the UK before. And the haste, and I should have been clearer on that, really refers to the efforts from DEC to try and turn the primary legislation, which is now a fact, into actual practical legislation which enables them to kick off the CFD, and now, as we heard only in December, the CFD auctions for established technologies. And the step from royal assent in December to first auctions, they're aiming for October this year. At this stage, none of us has any clue how these auctions will work. If we don't have a clue how these auctions work, it is impossible for us to secure debt for a new investment that we'd like to make. If we can't have certainty on the funding, there's no way we can go to our shareholders and present a new 50 million, 25-year investment in Scotland, for example. It's as simple as that.
I just want to finish off. Is it a level playing field? I mean, Oil and Gas UK seem to have an in with government at the moment at Westminster in terms of dialogue. And I think that came about after obviously the 2011 tax hike, and basically I think there was obviously a recognition that that was a mistake. So there seems to be dialogue. Is there a level playing field in terms of the renewable sector? Do you have that same dialogue with the UK government?
Eric.
I think the reason why there is this privileged dialogue, unsurprisingly, is due to the dependency on tax receipts from the oil and gas sector, which, as you can imagine, is many times bigger than the renewable side is today. I think it's also fair to say that the level of consolidation amongst the oil and gas players is a lot higher than what is today still a very young industry of renewables. Clearly, we're all aware of the significant inroads that companies like SSE and Scottish Power has made into that industry. But the reality is that it's still a very fragmented industry. And as a fragmented industry...
The energy of the future. So
it is the energy of the future, which means that if we were to project how this industry will look like 10 years from now, you will probably have seen a lot of consolidation taking place in the meantime to reflect the increased complexity of the sector. Again, coming back to the complexities of working in a CFD environment, we know that a lot of our much smaller renewable developers are struggling to keep up with the complexity of the new legislation. If you don't know how to position yourself in an auction-based CFD environment, you won't be able to secure the CFD to build out a project, even if you have secured consent for that particular project.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike McKenzie's got a supplementary.
Yes, thank you. And it was for Mark McAdam. Just in terms of EMR, and bearing in mind what Dr. Toke suggested, that if there was a no vote, he would like to see, I think, more energy powers devolved to Scotland. But the direction of travel doesn't seem to be in that direction. And what I'm talking about here is the loss of the renewable obligation in Scotland, that ability of the Scottish Government to create a kind of effective top-up for marine renewables. I wonder what Martin feels about that.
Yeah, thank you. It does create a big challenge. The fact is that marine renewables has moved at a slower pace than we had hoped. We do require additional investment to get the technology to a point where it is sufficiently reliable and can be deployed commercially. And one of the difficulties with EMR is that when we're looking at commercial deployments, it's beyond the current framework in terms of the EMR. So therefore, we're into an unknown. If somebody looks at our business and says, well, that's great, you have consented a couple of sites and your technology in a couple of years will be ready. What's going to happen after the current EMR framework period? And that's a very difficult challenge for us. We don't know. And the one thing, I know Eric's talked about the challenge of smaller developers understanding the complexity of EMR. For a small business like ours, trying to understand how EMR will work is great difficulty. I remember, I'm old enough or young enough to remember when the ROC system was introduced, and at that point in time I was working in the wind industry, and understanding how ROCs could be monetized was quite complex. It took several years for the banks to get comfortable with it. We financed our first project at Ardrossan in Scotland using ROCs, and once the first one was done, over a period of years, the banks got really comfortable, and then it became, fairly standard. So as soon as everybody gets comfortable with it, we say, well, we're going to change it. I think it's a real shame that in the last act, the Scottish Government lost its powers to actually direct incentive towards particular aspects of the industry through its ability to enhance the ROC offering. I think that was a terrible shame, but it is what it is. But I suppose the counterpoint to that was that it the UK government recognised that it did want to incentivise the marine industries and therefore adopted the policy that the Scottish government already had in relation to enhancing the rocks for those industries. Thank you.
Right. Margaret McDougall.
And good morning, panel. Ed Davey, the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, stated that in the event of an independent Scotland, there would be no need for the rest of the UK to support the Scotland's energy costs. How feasible is that? And I'll ask that to Dr. McEwen.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is where we need to separate out market integration in terms of trade with the subsidy mechanism. There's a little bit of a we can separate a little bit the tone of the Scotland analysis paper, which talks about more about things being unlikely, and the tone of the minister, which is a little bit more assertive. And that's been the tone across the Scotland analysis series, not just in the energy one. And I think one comment in general, I think that UK government ministers are perhaps putting themselves into a potentially difficult position, because if there is a yes vote, and they did perhaps want to be inclined to perhaps rethink some of those assertive statements, they may have made it politically difficult for them to do it. I think that you can source energy from Scotland without necessarily having to subsidise it, but if you needed to source it, then, and there was a desire for the subsidy mechanism to be shared throughout the UK, then that would give a little bit more influence to a Scottish government seeking to maintain that kind of system. The point I would make is that if you do want to maintain that kind of system, which is perfectly feasible, it's permissible under EU law, there is a precedent in the Norway-Swedish joint certificate scheme, so that's a precedent there already. It's perfectly possible to do it. Politically, it might be difficult. And I was thinking, as I was listening to my colleagues on the panel there, how much democracy and public opinion can often intervene to make things that are eminently sensible economically difficult to do politically. So I think that there are very real political issues in making that happen.
I just wanted to ask a further question. You can probably answer it as well, Dr. Toke. What does it mean to the consumer?
Where? In Scotland?
In Scotland.
Or in Scotland? Well, it depends. I mean, I think could an independent Scotland afford to promote renewable energy without a shared subsidy mechanism across the UK? Yes. If there was a political will to make that happen, then yes. And you can do that in a number of ways. You could do it by continuing to subsidise generally and pass on all of those costs to the consumer. It's probably not going to happen in that way. If there was a political will to make it happen, you would have to make it a priority in public policy, and you would have to make it a priority in the allocation of public spending. So there would likely be a mixture of these things, but it would be really important to bring the public on board in part of that venture. When I was doing some interviews in Denmark, I posed a question to a number of people working in the energy industry and in government there about why it was that they took the conscious decision to not join in the shared scheme with Sweden and Norway. And it's slightly different because they're not as big as the rest of the UK would be. And can a country of 5 million people afford to have its own generous subsidy scheme? And they looked at me as if I had two heads. And I think that the point there is that there's an interest that goes beyond supply issues. There's a broader manufacturing interest, there's a broader jobs interest. And I think that there's the start of something like that in Scotland. So the interests are much bigger and broader. But I think you really have to bring the public along with you.
I think the problems about allegedly large bills are some invention by the British government, who give the impression, without actually justifying this, that Scotland would have to pay for all the renewables that had been installed by the time of independence. So this is legal nonsense. They couldn't possibly do that, require retrospective legislation. And you can see that in 2012, the Westminster government lost a court case at the Supreme Court about incentives for solar power for projects that weren't even installed yet. So it's hardly going to be able to make Scottish consumers pay for schemes that have been installed or indeed are about to be installed. And it wouldn't actually be the Scottish government's problem. It would ruin the British electricity system, the British electricity companies to a greater or lesser extent, who would be extremely angry with Westminster. No, it is just a ridiculous scenario. And I know how it emerged, because I think the renewables industry were pressing for greater certainty through grandfathering of ROCs and so on. So the Whitehall thought to themselves, well, we can really scare them by implying that the opposite would happen. It's just political nonsense. As I said earlier, by the time that the incentive systems and the regulatory side of things becomes unscrambled, Scotland will have reached the bulk of its renewable energy target. It will be able to fund most of the rest through cheap onshore wind without very big increases in electricity bills, probably no more, possibly lower than what will be occurring in the rest of the UK for nuclear and a renewables programme that will be more expensive because perhaps there won't be any onshore wind in it if the Conservatives have anything to do with it. So now, as far as what happens until 2020, I actually think that public opinion, if you look at the interest coalitions in this, will be in favour of carrying on the EMR arrangements, admittedly imperfect though they are, until more or less 2020, because if you look at the coalition, the British electricity industry, who the British government have to keep on board because they need a lot of new power stations constructed, well, according to the strategy that they've got. So they are going to have to give way to this coalition, the British electricity industry. This is big industry, plus, of course, a lot of environmental NGOs, plus everybody, but perhaps a hardcore in the Conservatives, who are going to be in a minority at least until the 2015 election. So I don't see this consumer bills increases as being a great problem for Scotland to achieve its renewable energy targets, in short.
So, from what I've heard this morning, until 2020, there's going to have to be a whole lot of negotiation around a supply of electricity, you know, particularly if there is an independent Scotland, and that is going to take a lot of political will to get to an agreement. What happens post-2020 when, you know, are we going to be looking at a new EMR? Are we looking at, well, we will be looking at new targets. So, because, you know, this is long term, isn't it? And how does that affect investment in the long term?
It's fair to say that the EMR will probably still be the prevalent support regime post-2020. I think what is changing after 2020 is that, having reached the EU binding targets, countries may find themselves with a lot more freedom to establish where the carbon emission reductions are going to come from, because, as you know, the current view from the EU is to sign up to a binding carbon emission reduction by 2030, but without specifying where these reductions have to come from. Whereas the regime that we find ourselves now is one where there was a specific target around sourcing of renewable energy, and that's how the UK got to its 15% renewable energy target. Those fall away after 2020, but it's not like the UK or Scotland, for that matter, fall into a vacuum. Because, as you know, there's already been the Scotland Climate Change Act, which has set very ambitious targets all the way till 2050, which set out an 80% reduction in emissions versus 1990 levels. So it's not like either Scotland or the UK would be without a long-term objective. The only thing that would fall away is the stick that the EU currently has to call individual countries into account if they have not met their binding targets. And the stick that they have is the ability to impose fines from 2020 onwards. Those fines would fall away beyond the current 2020 frame, because then it falls much more upon individual countries to see how they implement initiatives to meet the Climate Change Act's 2050 emission reduction targets. And there are no sort of sticks provided for that at the moment. But we would expect the EMR, God forbid, given the fact that it's just being introduced now in 2014, to still be around in 2020, because otherwise you will have a new revenue support regime at, every 5 years. You start following a political cycle, which I think is untenable for an industry which relies on certain 20, 25-year outlooks to justify its investments.
If I can just contribute to this debate, we have to remember what the EMR is. I mean, the fact is that the EMR doesn't cover just renewables, it covers all technologies. But inside the EMR, we have a mechanism which is, you have to learn this whole new vocabulary when you start talking about this market. You have a construct which is called the levy control framework. And basically this is an assigned amount of money which will be used to incentivize various technologies. And within that defined amount of money, we have to incentivize nuclear. We have to incentivize the other low-carbon technologies as well. And the risk here, which I think is the biggest impact in terms of investors, is that if you are looking at an onshore wind farm or development, in order to get through the permitting process and you end up where you say, I now have a grid connection, I have a permitted plant. Today, if you start construction of that, you will get the renewable obligation certificates associated with that plant. However, in the context of the electricity market reform, and I think this is one of the biggest as yet to be understood risks, you will spend those millions of pounds consulting it, getting the permit for that plant, or indeed if it's an offshore wind plant, it will be in the tens of millions of pounds in order to permit that. You end up then, okay, we're ready to go, we have a grid connection, we have it permitted, we've spent, in the case of an offshore wind plant, maybe £50 million to do this. At that point in time, you have no guarantee that that project will be funded under the EMR. And I think, Eric, that's one of the biggest risks that we now have until we actually understand how this works. And people have said, well, we'll use auctions. Well, again, I'm young enough to remember that we did have an auction scheme available, which was the non-fossil fuel obligation system, and that was incredibly inefficient. Auctions need to be accurately designed to give the desired outcome. You can have somebody who just says, well, I'll put in a bid for that auction, they win, but they don't have any obligation to build a plant. Then they're sitting, preventing other people from actually constructing a plant. So I think the mechanism here and the levy control framework and the ability to get people to continue to invest under the EMR framework. And when I mean invest, it's not in the construction of the plant, it's invest in actually permitting and developing the permit for the plant. I think that's a big unknown challenge for us. And nobody wants to see too much change. I mean, I recall when Dr. McEwen and Dr. Toke were talking earlier about the Midwest ISO or the Nord Pool. Those constructs of markets have been there. When I was working in the US back in 1989, you had it there. The Nord Pool market, I don't know how long that's been in place, but it's for, tens of decades, essentially. Whereas in the UK here, we've gone through the privatization, then we had the pool system, then we had the NETA, then we had the BETA, then we introduced the ROCs, now we've introduced the EMR, and this is all within, a couple of decades. So the ability for us to give this kind of long-term, stable market signals is very important. And while I wouldn't like anybody to say we'll replace EMR or it would disappear in 2020, I think we'll have to look at the effect of EMR. And the question is, if there's a, going back to the previous question, if there is a yes vote or a no vote, if we're not seeing the activity in the market that we want to see in terms of energy policy, I would hate to have to revisit the electricity market, but it may be necessary if those signals aren't delivering the desired outcome.
On a couple of things that I've heard. First of all, I think energy policy in Scotland, if it were to be a distinctive energy policy, would have to take the broader EU framework into account, perhaps more than UK government policy does currently. And while it may not be the case that member states have individual renewables targets, I think there will be still a will across the EU from the EU institutions to promote renewable energy. It may be sort of by grouping together member states on a regional basis, and I think that offers clear opportunities to Scotland under any constitutional scenario where the leadership in the renewables field, particularly in terms of wind, has been recognised at an EU level. So there are opportunities there, whatever the outcome. I suppose that with the levy control framework, I don't pretend to be an expert in it at all, but I think while some of the rationale is sound in a desire to not impose too much of a burden on consumers, though there are probably arguably other ways around that, I think there is a risk that partly it deters investment, as has been said, but also partly that it imposes a ceiling on ambition. And I think that in a post-yes scenario, I think the Scottish Government would have to think very carefully about whether its ambitions for the longer term could be realised within the constraints that are set by a UK policy framework.
Thank you.
I mean, I just want to bring in Alan Johnson. Can I just go back to Dr. Toke, your comments, because you're very robust in your view about the UK government's Scotland analysis paper. And I mean, in fact, you say in your written submission for the UK government to say that they would not pay subsidies post-independence would be illegal. I mean, is that a legal opinion?
It's my opinion. And it
but you're not a lawyer. I mean, have you taken a legal opinion on this?
No, I haven't, but I can look at what legal opinions are and past case law, and I'm talking about incentives, subsidies, call them what you will, for schemes already in place or about to be installed. And the legal position on that is very clear, and I refer to a legal judgment regarding solar power in 2012, where the government was knocked back purely on the issue of cutting back promised levels of support for solar PV that hadn't actually been installed yet. So it's fairly ludicrous to suggest that you're going to be legally sound by cancelling incentives for schemes that have already been installed. I mean, that seems to be an open and shut case. You know, you can argue about what happens between independence and 2020, though I think I'd agree with the consensus here that there'd be a lot of strong, again, legal arguments that these were schemes that people would plan to be put in place, and there's the EU directive, and in practice there'd be a strong political coalition to continue the arrangements until 2020, but thereafter Scotland would have to pay for new capacity.
Sorry, Nicola McKeon. Just
briefly, I think there's a difference between feed-in tariffs here and the renewable obligation in that I think feed-in I'm not a lawyer, but I think feed-in tariffs have a legal standing as a legal contract that might be more difficult to alter than is the case with potentially with the RO. I've always assumed that the RO would be part of that negotiation over shared assets and liabilities in the context of independence negotiations. And I think there are bigger fish to fry in that context, and it may simply be that the conclusion is that it's easier all round to carry on. But I think they do have a different legal standing.
If I could add on, if you look at the mechanics of it all carefully, the government, in order to affect the incentivisation of existing RO schemes, may, for instance, decide not to make RO incentives transferable as they are now. The ROCs are transferable between the Scottish and the English and Welsh and Northern Ireland renewable obligations. That would be one fairly simple way of doing it. But again, the Scottish, well, sorry, not just the Scottish, but the British electricity industry as a whole would then mount a legal challenge that's saying you are depriving us of our assets under human rights law apart from anything else. And I would be asking then the political question, hey, you want us to invest in these power stations and you're depriving us of getting profits, making money from the renewables sector? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me.
Interesting debate, and perhaps we need to ask a lawyer to get a legal opinion. Right, I'll bring in Alison Johnson.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. Part of the briefing the committee received this morning from SPICE, we're told from one professor of economics at Aberdeen University suggests that energy bills are going to rise in all cases due to increased subsidy to renewables and nuclear. We hear from another expert who suggests that under no scenario can I see in an independent Scotland electricity bills increasing. We hear from the BBC's economic correspondents that the fact that given the UK's dependence on Scotland to supply a growing demand for energy and to meet its European targets for renewables, that some kind of deal is likely to be struck if Scotland votes for independence. But the UK government, in their paper, they state that in the event of independence, the integrated GB market could not continue in its current form. Is that a fact? I mean, I sort of see parallels with the monetary union debate at the moment. Will this inability to negotiate or to continue, will that change the day after a yes vote? I'm not sure who'd like to tackle that.
Well, maybe go along the panel, Dr.
Well, I think there are different issues here. I think there's very little disagreement that trading would continue. This is a requirement of the European network of transmission systems operators electricity, which includes non-EU members as well as EU members, by the way. So that's a no-brainer. But system operator, would there be a common system operator? Would you carry on more or less with the current arrangements with and change the curtains a bit? Yes, almost certainly. I mean, look at this in terms of what's in people's interests. Now, if you don't have a common system operator, the UK loses real reserve capacity from Scotland, but of at least equal importance, they also lose the ability to manage the variable pulses of renewable electricity coming from Scotland, which means they have to always close down their own power stations and when there is an excess supply. It doesn't matter whether it's 4, 5, 6%. It's still a problem, which is resolvable if only they have a common system operator. So it's clearly sensible for England's point of view to have a common system operator. I mean, people go on about, oh well, when Slovakia and the Czech Republic split up, these agreements disappeared. Well, the point was they didn't have a system of variable electricity supplies, and they didn't have a British electricity industry that was interested in getting a return on its investment and investing in a lot of power stations south of England. It seems to we'll also have a common system operator, but that will coexist with different regulatory regimes. and post-2020 different incentive systems for renewable energy and energy efficiency.
Thank you.
I fear that electricity bills will probably rise regardless of the outcome of this referendum, and probably have little to do with that. There's a whole host of factors that shape the cost of electricity. Governments can mitigate that by investing much more in reducing demand and promoting energy efficiency. And I would like to see a lot more of that. And on the issue of costs rising as a result of public policy and promoting renewables we're discussing today, or promoting nuclear or whatever, I think that there are political and policy judgments to be made as to whether or not a government wants to promote expensive technologies, whatever they may be, and whether it wants to pass on the costs of that to consumers or finance it through taxation or some other tax relief mechanism. Nothing is set in stone, and it's very difficult to foresee how things will be, and different parties and different governments will make different choices. Is the UK government Scotland analysis paper stating a fact? No. I think it's stating an assertion. The one thing one of the things I would take issue with in the paper is that one thing I would agree on is that they do say that the common market, the common GB market, is more integrated than many of the other examples that are often referred to in the Nord Pool and even the All Ireland market, and I think that's true. But they therefore say that means you can't have it, and it takes years to get to that stage. And it does take years to get to that stage, but we would not be starting from the same position. I think it's very different across all of these things if you're starting from a position of integration and you want to maybe loosen some of the arrangements. I think that's a very different starting point that has to be taken into account and isn't taken into account in the Scotland analysis paper.
Thank you. I think this is quite a challenging question you've set us. The fact is that energy prices are going to continue to rise regardless of an outcome in terms of independence, which I think our other speakers have said. I mean, I just want to remind people that between 2000 and 2010, the price paid by power producers for coal increased in real terms by 71%. The price paid by power producers for natural gas increased in real terms by 90%. When people say, you know, my energy bills have gone up, you know, renewable energy is about 9% of the energy mix that we have in the whole of the UK. So I know there's a hysteria which says, you know, the only reason energy bills are going up is because of renewables. And the fact is that that is not the case. The underlying source, the fuel source for renewables, it costs zero. You know, wind it costs zero today, it'll be zero tomorrow, and 10 years in the future. And there's been studies done. Now, these studies happen to be, they're quite complex, but if you ask anybody, it says, how do you reduce the overall risk within a portfolio, whether that is a portfolio of energy assets or it's a personal portfolio in terms of equities, then what you do is you invest in assets which are not linked or correlated. So therefore, if you invest in renewables, then you're delinking, that is completely delinked from an investment you might make in coal or gas or indeed nuclear assets. Therefore, you're reducing the overall volatility in the energy pricing by having renewables as part of your energy mix. If you look at DEC's own paper, what they say in that paper, if we look at energy prices in 2020, and I have to say that, you know, looking forward is going to be extremely difficult because the impact of political situations around the world have a massive impact in terms of our energy costs. But when they produced this paper last year, basically what they said is by having the proposed mix of renewables within the UK energy mix, that would actually have an impact in 2020 of reducing our overall energy bills. Now, that is hard for people to understand because the maths behind it are difficult. But what they're saying is you're reducing the overall riskiness of your energy portfolio. And I think that that but regardless of the impact of renewables in reducing our energy bills overall in the future, we have to accept that the only way energy prices have gone ever is upwards. Now, you might have short-term blips as a result of gas fracking in the United States caused gas prices to drop dramatically. However, gas prices in the United States are now recovering dramatically. We will have the opportunity for fracked gas in the UK. The extent to which that actually impacts on pricing is unknown. Some people have said it will have minimal impact simply because we're so dependent on imported gas anyway, and therefore if we produce our own gas, then all you have to do is sell it at 1 penny less and it will be used because it's cheaper, but you don't sell it at, 50p less because you don't need to. So I think this is a very complex situation, and I think regardless of a scenario with or without independence, I think the best thing that we can do is to invest in energy sources which are within our own control, i.e. within the national board or whatever that happens to be, and also to invest in assets which have zero variability in their raw material or fuel costs.
Yeah, fully subscribe to, I think, the very eloquent description that Martin just made. If I may just add to that the fact that clearly the thermal baseload capacity, which is fundamental for an industrial economy to operate, benefited from the fact that most of the thermal baseload power plants were built in the 60s and the 70s and hence were almost fully depreciated. So you had a perfect storm of depreciated assets on a baseload basis and for long-term benefiting from low input costs from fossil fuels. And the latter, as Martin described, clearly has come to an end. And the only alternative that we as societies are embracing at the moment, given the sudden awareness of the impact that thermal fossil fuel power generation has had on potential climate change acceleration, is to take on the challenge of saying we're going to do it on a more low carbon basis. Now that is it's not a once in a generation, it is a once in a century fundamental shift. And that sits very awkwardly with the much more short-term cycle that politicians need to operate in when they need to be able to tell to their electorate that power bills will not be rising more than inflation. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges. So yes, I think generally speaking, most observers would expect power prices to continue to rise. I think the debate needs to be had with the voters in any country that this is part of a choice so that we can hand over our societies to future generations without them looking back at us and say, how could you ever get away with cheap electricity, getting all the CO2 up in the atmosphere, and we're paying the price? To expect that that transition is going to happen without some sort of financial contribution from us today, I think is illusory.
I'd just like to make another contribution to this. And you talked about, energy bills. That's the bills for the consumer. And one of the things that we've seen is it depends also, and Dr. McEwen alluded to it, it's how we count for certain things, whether it's included in the electricity bill that we get or whether it's part of the tax base. And I think that's quite important too, because the one thing we have to say about renewable energy is that the costs are completely transparent. I mean, there is an incentive, yes, with the ROCs, but that's known and quantified, and therefore everybody knows what that incentive it is, and that incentive does end up in your electricity bill. And I just want to give it a very short example of this. We have, for example, the Department of Energy Climate Change. Their budget is, I think it's around $3 billion. It's more than $3 billion, but it's approximately $3 billion. But of that 3 billion, 15 million goes towards incentivising renewable energy in terms of research and development and other things. The rest, the bulk of the rest, about 2.3 billion of that goes to the nuclear industry. So that is in effect a subsidy. And what is that subsidy used for? It's used for research and development, running at about 400 million a year, far greater than the research and development into renewables. But also 2 billion of that goes to the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. So if you take something like that and instead of putting it in the electricity bill, you hide it in the tax bill, then, you know, is the energy price lower as a result of that? Well, the energy price I get in my electricity bill is lower because the cost of decommissioning the nuclear plants is not included in my electricity bill. But every other, you know, you would argue on a total basis, has that increased my energy cost? Well, yes, it has, because I pay more tax to cover the cost of that. So again, what's transparent and what's not transparent, what's included in an electricity bill or what's included in the tax bill needs to be counted for when we talk about energy prices.
Thank you.
Sorry, Al, just before you come in, can I just say we're doing very well for time, but we're getting a little behind the clock, and if we could sharpen up a little bit on the questions and responses, that would be very helpful. Otherwise, we're going to be here till long after our scheduled time. Sorry, Alison,
Yes.
carry on.
The convener having said that, I did think they were really illuminating responses. Thank you very much. Can I just ask, how can we ensure that Scottish renewable energy costs remain competitive without a GB-wide subsidy? And I think Dr McEwen and Dr Tope, you were sort of touching on this earlier. I mean, politicians have a job of ensuring that people understand what they're investing in. I mean, obviously, if you invest in renewables, there's an opportunity for communities to benefit. Last night, there was an event in Parliament, Scotland's Colleges, and I heard from a lecturer from Fife College. He lectures wind turbine apprentices, and he informed me that if you're working on a wind farm in Scotland, you're not allowed to stay further than 40 minutes from that wind farm. So there are all sorts of economic benefits there too. Are these the kind of things that we would have to make sure the population understood if there was to be a withdrawal of any subsidy? How can we better make sure that the population understand, you know, the fact that, you know, the Hinkley Point reactor is going to increase people's energy bills for some 30 years or more?
Stake. I mean, there's a lot of evidence now to suggest that if people have a stake in the enterprise, then they're more likely to support it. So the various models of community ownership and co-ownership that are being tested in Scotland, I'd like to see more of that, and I think that would be one way to help sustain popular support beyond community benefit models. I think that I'd like to see a little bit more than that. But that's one way to try and build consent for making this a priority of public expenditure.
Is anyone aware of any example ever of communities being able to invest in or share profits from a nuclear reactor?
Is this a joke? I would like, on the subject of how a Scottish government could deliver renewables more cheaply than the UK government's methods, well, yes, they could. Firstly, by reinstating the original RO time period of 20-year effective contracts, which would bring down the headline price for onshore wind, potentially make the extra incentives in the future quite small. Then you could have specific schemes for the community sector, which has an excellent report in which University of Edinburgh and Nicola was involved in, demonstrated achieves very high levels of planning community acceptance. You can have schemes for them. I mean, one thing that may be surprising, but if we're looking at internationally, it does seem that independents, and I'm sorry to annoy anybody from SSE or Scottish Power around, but independents do seem internationally, given a given technical project, seem to deliver it for rather lower costs than the big electricity companies. So you can actually have a system that will have lower incentives for community schemes, but perhaps backed, which is what they need, by some loan guarantees or cheap finance. And fact is that the big electricity majors, not just SSE and Scottish Power, but others as well, own the rights to a lot of Scottish wind farms. So you can't just go into a fixed feed-in tariff, which is a system I would ideally prefer. I produced a report for Friends of the Earth on that a couple of years back. You'd have to have something that gave some extra money to the big guys. I say that with gnashing my teeth a bit there, for practical purposes. But again, you give longer contracts, which would reduce the price. And onshore wind prices are actually coming down on the international markets after a bit of a spike a few years ago.
Just like to contribute very quickly. There is a role for the industry to play here as well. I mean, we shouldn't be incentive junkies. We need to get to a point where the renewable energy industry does not require any incentive. And I think that means that a sensible policy, we talked about energy policy, or sensible energy policy has to be one which gives the economic benefit you spoke about, but also incentivizes the industry to get to a point where it's competing without any subsidy at all. And I think that government certainly has a role to play in that in terms of research and development, and there are some programs underway. But certainly for onshore wind, we should be looking at eliminating that subsidy completely over time.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that the moment where power price parity will become reality, which is where the power provided by an onshore wind farm would be sold at the same price as wholesale power prices, that we will probably see that sort of tipping point in the early years of the next decade, which is not very far away in infrastructure sector mindset. Coming back on the community element, I fully agree with you, Alison, that if there's one thing that distributed renewable generation technologies give the opportunity to local communities to get involved with, is being able to, one, benefit from community benefit funds, which most of us, systematically include as part of our development projects. The next stage, which is to involve more structurally a local community that is keen to co-invest, is a very interesting idea, but it is much more complex to put into action. Because as you can imagine, if we see ourselves as a sort of 25-year owner-operator of a farm, and we have a group of local enthusiasts who are keen to co-invest, a typical 2-megawatt turbine today will cost you about, roughly speaking, £2 million to invest in. We need to be sure that the enthusiasts that are keen to put maybe £5,000 or £10,000 in today won't want to withdraw their money 2 years from now if one wants to buy a new car. We do not have that option as a long-term owner. So the community benefit co-ownership options that are currently being discussed very publicly, I think we as developers strongly support that, but it needs to be within the framework of a long-term infrastructure sector. We can't end up having dedicated people whose task is to manage people who ask for withdrawal of their funds, other coming in, etc., etc. That would make it too complex to manage.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Dick Willie.
Thank you. Good morning. I wonder if I may introduce the elephant in the room. I have a letter from the Deputy Prime Minister. It's what I call my Dear Chick from Nick letter. And it says,
The coalition agreement is clear. New nuclear can go ahead so long as it is without subsidy. New nuclear will receive no levy, direct payment or market support for electricity supplied or capacity provided. I wonder if you could, particularly Dr. Toke and Mr. Michaels, what is your view on the subsidy to be offered by the UK government for nuclear generation and its impact on the availability for long-term investment for renewable technologies? I mean, Hinkley Point, we're talking about £35 billion subsidy, roughly 4 times the total cost of the RO across the UK during the first 10 years of its operation. I mean, what do you see to be the major implications for renewable technology capital investment because of the subsidy that is now being offered, despite dear Nick's letter, for nuclear generation in England and Wales?
Okay, can we give a fairly brief response to this, please? Yeah.
Well, it is clearly state aid, otherwise they wouldn't be making a state aid application to the EU, whatever else you call it. I mean, in terms of effect on renewable investment, well, we've already heard references to the levy control framework, which puts a limit on low-carbon spending. So it's a no-brainer to say that if you spend on nuclear, there's less on renewables. And there's actually no renewable spending allocated by the Treasury stroke DEC after 2020. And the only spending, in effect, is allocated is for Hinkley C and Sizewell B, if it gets going. So that sort of answers the question. And when you're comparing, I just add, when you're comparing the headline prices, onshore wind is now set to get a lower headline price, no mind anything else, than the nuclear. It's only getting a 15-year contract. It's getting no loan guarantees, whereas Hinkley C is getting a 35-year contract and loan guarantees. And wind turbines actually can, in theory, last a long time. There are some in Altamont Pass that have been going for more than 30 years now. It's planning, well, not so much planning, but the fact that new incentive systems come along so people can reboot the site quite simply with new turbines.
Just like to contribute very quickly again. I know you're under pressure, Chairman, for time, but it is extremely disappointing that we've made this decision. As I say, we've nothing against nuclear, but the fact, and it's a clear example of where there are certain costs which are being externalised, which don't appear in the energy bill for nuclear, and Dr. Toke has alluded to them. It is a bit like George Orwell's 1984, you know, all animals are created equal, and then there's little bits added to that phrase over time. So I know the Deputy PM said that, and then Ed Davies spoke here at the Marriott Hotel, and he said, unless there's a similar subsidy for other industries, and so on. So it kind of grew arms and legs. And the fact is now we have the most expensive power station ever constructed. If it goes ahead, it will be. And there's a few things within that we just have to say. It's 35 billion of direct subsidy. When you add in the cost of the guarantee, when you add in, there's a political risk guarantee given by the UK government as well.
One of the things it doesn't include, of course, is the insurance requirements for nuclear power
It
stations.
doesn't include the insurance requirements, but they're capped at £1 billion. So therefore, if there was an accident, and we can only look and hope that there never will be, and you know, the nuclear industry is relatively safe, but the impact of an accident in the nuclear industry has far-reaching consequences. And we, the taxpayer, will take up the cost above £1 billion if there was an incident at the plant. So what is the cost of those externalities? And there's a security externality as well. And there's a long-term high-level radiation geological disposal, which is not included in that cost. When you layer in all those costs on top of the direct £35 billion subsidy, then it's not just that nuclear is more expensive than onshore wind. Nuclear, if you include all of those, is more expensive than offshore wind. Now, the point I have to say is I'm not against nuclear. If we decide that nuclear has to be part of our mix, then let's have it. But let's have an honest discussion as to what its costs are. And if for security reasons we determine that that's the appropriate thing to do, then we should do it. But it is an example of policy failure as far as I'm concerned, because it means that the only way you can get investors to invest in the UK in a plant which is that asset life is to give a UK government guarantee, to give a UK government political risk guarantee, to give a UK government capping of the insurance liability guarantee, to give a waste disposal guarantee, and so on. That's the only way it happens, and that is failure.
I'm not a great expert in the nuclear industry, but I think we need to tighten our vocabulary. I think that I assume that the Vice Prime Minister is technically correct in what he states in his letter to you, because the 35 billion, and perhaps I'm mistaken, the 35 billion is not going to be a subsidy. It is EDF and debt holders who will have to stump up the capital to build the plant in the first place. The £105 per megawatt hour, that real 2012 money that will be given as the cost per megawatt hour, will be paid directly through consumers' bills. So he is right, technically speaking, in saying that contrary to a situation like the RO, where we receive £45 per megawatt hour, but that is billed as a tax.
No, it's not. Yeah. The RO is in your electricity bills.
Yeah, but the technical, if you ask, because we had that issue as well, the RO is billed as, even though it comes through electricity bills, it is considered to be indirect taxation. That is very interesting. So, technically speaking, I think he's probably right in his letter, but I think it's playing it right on the edge of, and clearly it omits, I think, all the points that Martin indicated about.
When I give you a copy, and I will give you a copy of the letter, I think you'll find he's gone over the edge. But anyway, let me, if I may, just briefly, the last question. Dr. Togue, you and I happily shared in a debate hosted by EET-Connect in March this year at the Edinburgh offices of Anderson Strathern. Now, that debate, you said, and we've just heard about Ed Davies' comments varying from the Deputy Prime Minister. His comments on energy, you said that his comments on energy costs and independence were at best wrong and at worst nonsense. Do you still hold that view?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, entrenched by the energy analysis. That,
No more questions. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Okay, Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. My questions are principally for Martin McAdam. People have said to me that renewable energy is the biggest socio-economic game changer the Highlands and Islands of Scotland have ever known. I'm sure you'll sympathise with the immense frustration that exists there on the issue of grid constraint. Large numbers of people are telling me that for that reason alone they intend to vote yes in the referendum. But I wonder if you share my disappointment to learn that Seatricity announced their intention a few weeks back to relocate from Orkney to Cornwall, purely because of the failure of the UK government to provide an interconnector to Orkney, something they've talked about for 10 years, or perhaps a bit more than that now, but failed to deliver on. And do you agree with me that the Ofgem mechanism for deciding whether or not an interconnector can be provided is really not fit for purpose?
Yeah, unfortunately, the grid is a huge challenge. You know, we all know why. When power plants were centralised, they were built. You built big transmission pipes to carry the load to the cities. The paradigm has changed now. We understand the benefits of renewable energy, but the mechanism by which those big pipes, those big transmission lines are constructed, and the basis on which they're costed by Ofgem remains the same, which is just, you know, it's frustrating. We've been through this on many occasions. Ofgem do have an obligation in relation to sustainability, and we've challenged them publicly in relation to this matter, but they don't actually understand what sustainability means. And it was very interesting that one of the individuals who spoke, they said, well, that's someone else in a different department who looks after sustainability. But if we truly want to exploit, I mean, this is back to the point where we have to put a value on achieving energy security and low carbon in terms of our energy mix. And that value in terms of the transmission charging mechanism just isn't there yet. It is frustrating. I know that the Scottish Government is working, on this occasion Minister Ewing with Minister Ed Davey, on this particular challenge. You know, it is a big one, but if we want to exploit that resource, and we've got to remember that exploiting the resource on the islands around Scotland, even if we just look at the onshore wind resource, that has to be, if not more cost effective, at least cost effective as trying to exploit the offshore wind resource around the rest of the UK. And I think we have to think creatively. For the offshore wind plants, we created these off-tow arrangements. So we should consider differently how these transmission lines should be built. But I'm afraid I have to agree with you. It's incredibly frustrating.
And I wonder if you share my disappointment about the further delay in implementing the Project Transmit recommendations. I believe that's been delayed for a further 18 months. Do you share my frustration with that?
I hadn't realised it was delayed for a further 18 months. Let me just confer with my colleague. Is it 18 months? Yeah, I think there's been a challenge as to the methodology, so it has been put back. It has been put back, and that's, again, incredibly disappointing. I don't understand the reasons for that. I'll get briefed on it later, but yes, that's very frustrating.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a model of brevity. Thank you. Marco Biaggi.
Thank you. We talked before briefly about the EU targets and the obligation by 2020 under the Renewable Energy Directive. Now, for the UK, that's 15% of energy, not electricity, energy from renewable sources. At present, that figure is 4%, and I believe the estimation of how much has to be added to the UK's electricity supply is to take it up to 35% of electricity from renewable sources. Now, just how important is Scotland in that as a question of scale? Because it seems to me that to go from where we are right now, which is, I believe, about 10% of electricity being renewable and from rest of UK, to 35% if there was no access to Scottish, would be, well, quite a hill to climb. Can anyone give a comment on that? Am I right in my assumption?
Yeah. Well, you're more than right. The UK's National Renewable Energy Action Plan actually stipulates a heightened build-up towards the end of the 2020. It was structured that way for political reasons. But they obviously weren't thinking of the independence debate, because this is precisely the time when they threatened to cut off the support. So there'll be a lot of legal arguments going on about that. It's a matter of interpretation. I'm not going to pronounce an opinion on that one, but there will be a big political resource for those arguing for continuation of the EMR to include Scotland until 2020. And as I say, I think in practice it would be backed by quite a strong industrial political coalition of the British electricity industry and lots of NGOs, and should command a majority in the House of Commons. That's my opinion.
If our UK was to attempt to reach that 35% on their own through our UK renewable potential, what impact would that have on prices in the rest of the UK?
Well, it would be very high. I mean, it just wouldn't happen. There's a short answer to that.
Fair enough. And another question about percentages that are kicking about without Scotland. One of the figures for margin for spare capacity is 2% by 2015-16, I believe. Is it therefore the case that without Scotland, one harsh winter and the lights go out in London?
Well, I wouldn't. I mean, the National Grid have hands on a lot of levers. I don't want to start pressing panic buttons on that. But let's put it this way, the British electricity industry will be saying to the government, look, you want us to invest in a lot of power stations, you are going to give us these investments in renewables, aren't you, including, of course, the ones in Scotland. I think that's going to be the question.
But, I mean, in practice, a 2% margin, it's rather worrying. I mean, obviously they can import and they can take energy in extremis from France or from Scotland, but that's a very tight margin, especially when it's compared with 20% in Scotland.
Well, it gives the British electricity industry, the big six, etc., very great extra political leadership, leverage. That's the key point in this, I think.
But at the same time, I think it highlights yet again the dependency on creating stability and certainty for these big six to invest going forward. You will not be surprised that in the current sort of turbulent utility investor environment, most investment plans for new thermal capacity has been frozen. And given the overall uncertainty around the energy policy, that starts to affect renewables investment as well. So you're absolutely right, 2-3% is uncomfortably tight. That assumes that the interconnector capacity that exists today, 2 gigawatt with France, 1 gigawatt with Holland, is fully utilized for that matter. So the natural reaction that's going to happen, given the fact that there's no other interconnection capability, is that power prices will go up. Right? And that's something that, again, that's something that, you know, politicians in Westminster today, I think, are very keen not to emphasize too much for the obvious reasons.
And lastly, I believe there's an ongoing question mark over EU state aid and Hinkley nuclear deal. Is that the case? And if it were to be the case that the deal was ruled impermissible, would that be, well, what challenges would that present to the UK, given that that would basically send their energy policy back to square one?
Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with the EU challenge in relation to state aid. They've highlighted all the areas that we spoke about earlier in relation to the subsidy, direct, but also the indirect subsidies in relation to the debt guarantee, the political risk guarantee, the insurance cap. All of these things have been highlighted as part of the EU's case. You know, I think the EU is, I can't say how this, what the outcome would be here. I think they would be reluctant at the end of the day. There's always a deal to be done, isn't there? And would we see a nuclear plant? Probably yes. I think that the state aid issue is incredibly important, and we should contribute to allowing people to understand that. As I say, whether it's the state aid issue or not is kind of, I suppose the only reason that that becomes important is if it prevents the plant from getting built. If it gets the plant from getting built, then we have to look at, you know, what the outcomes we're trying to determine. Now, why would there be a state aid issue here? We're talking about a technology. When I look at our industry, which is the wave industry, we don't have a commercial wave plant running anywhere. So do we need incentives and grant and capital grants and other things to allow us to get there? Yes, of course we do. But the nuclear industry, you could hardly argue that it is not a mature industry. It's been around for over 60 years. So the concept that it should still require this level of intervention is mind-boggling. Now, if the impact is that the plant gets built, then I think what we have to do then, and what I hope that the EU would do would say, okay, you're building the plant, but let's be clear, the cost is not 35 billion a year. The cost is 70 billion a year, or whatever the number will emerge as. And that is then the benchmark against which other low carbon technologies should be assessed, not the headline number, which is 35 billion. If it didn't get built, what would the impact be? I think that it would mean a huge rethink in the context of the low carbon economy for the UK, because that would mean that essentially nuclear is off the agenda.
I think it's ironic that state aid, which was intended to prevent protection of domestic industries is causing this issue with a company that will really be bringing all its benefit back to France and China, but I won't ask that. I'll let that rest and pass that on.
Sorry, Nick Levin wants to come in.
On the EU targets, you said something, Marco, about would our UK be able to meet its EU target? Well, it's not an our UK target, it's a UK target. And actually, I think it will be difficult to meet with Scotland, let alone without. But I don't want to get into the issue of successor states and all the rest of it, but presumably that target would be part of our UK's renegotiation with the EU in the event of negotiating independence. So the target itself might change, though presumably one that still needs to be met.
Our UK's target is one of the lowest in the EU already.
Other interesting question, which we don't have time to consider, is what happens if neither Scotland or our UK are in the EU? But anyway, we'll leave that for another day. Joan McAlpin.
A study by Scottish Renewables suggested that 11,695 people are currently in full-time employment in the renewables industry, which was an increase of 5% from the previous year's study. What's your view, the panel's view, on if the renewables industry got the kind of government support that you would all like it to get? What is the jobs potential for Scotland in the renewables industry?
Right, can we get, is that directed to somebody in particular?
I'd quite like to hear Mr McAdam's view on it.
All right, can we be fairly brief?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's what we've seen in our space, the marine space, and in the wave space in particular, is basically we have got substantial engagement, for example, in Orkney. We spent a lot of money in the local community there. It has created jobs directly. Of that 11,695, we estimated it was about 250 in Orkney, but the people in Orkney tell me it's more like 900 people involved in Orkney. The islands there, a population of 19,000. That's a very significant impact, and that's just for the marine space in Orkney. One of the successes that we've seen, and hopefully this comes to fruition, is that in England we now have this Siemens plant being constructed for the delivery of the offshore wind turbines. I think that one of the areas that we need to do more is to encourage that manufacturing base. We talked about some of the impact in terms of wind farm technicians, involvement of the local communities, the local enterprise. I certainly believe that in terms of what we're doing, spending within Scotland makes a lot of sense. We want to bring the hearts and minds with us, and therefore delivering economic value as part of what we're doing is incredibly important. I would certainly like to encourage and understand how we encourage deeper levels of manufacturing within this industry in Scotland. And it's an area I know that's been worked on, but certainly it's something we need more success there, and I would like to see a plant built in Scotland delivering for the wind space.
Would you see a yes vote as offering the kind of conditions that would perhaps accelerate that process towards a manufacturing base?
I've always said in relation to the independence question, because people challenge me and say, oh, Scotland will be a bad place to invest. No, Scotland today is a good place to invest. The one thing we have as an advantage over the rest of the UK is that, in fairness to the Scottish governments, not just the current one, they have been consistent in relation to their policy towards renewable energy, and that has been a very positive thing. So the developers like working in Scotland. There is, the DEC report was out yesterday, but covering the whole of the UK. 80% of the people across the whole of the UK believe that renewable energy and wind turbines are good things. In Scotland, the percentage is even higher. So you have a community which is supportive, and you have a Scottish government through its various incarnations have been very supportive. And that is what the investors are looking for. It's very simple. Don't mess with the policies. Keep it stable. If you want to introduce change, introduce it at a pace which is acceptable, and you will get the benefit. I would like to see more in terms of manufacturing, but I think that that's still to win for Scotland.
Mr Matthews, would you?
Absolutely. Very concretely, 4 years ago we had 10 employees in Scotland. Today we have more than 30. which represents almost 10% of our overall employee headcount at Infinis. Given the fact that the 75% of our growth plans in terms of investment are based in Scotland, we see the continued support around the very motivational framework that Martin just described as very conducive, not just to channel investment in new capital expenditure, but the natural element that goes with it, which is to invest in broadening, in increasing our staff in Scotland. I think one of the exciting developments, we talked about the hubs and the wind turbines that Siemens may be building in England. There's tremendous opportunity for more insourcing. Yeah, when we place our orders for new projects in Scotland, yes, a lot of the very high-tech turbine-related technologies will tend to be manufactured in Germany or in Denmark, that's a fact. But when you look at the tower itself, there's no reason why the towers couldn't be built in Scotland today. And I believe there's one supplier, and what we're increasingly doing is to encourage our German or Danish suppliers to include the optionality of local insourcing of tower components in their bids, because we feel that that's a natural part of the package in investing for the long term in Scotland.
Well, I only draw attention to the DEC survey that was published yesterday, which showed that renewable energies, including onshore wind, were much more popular with the public than either nuclear power or shale gas. So, given the cost discussion we've had, why is there any doubts about giving preference to renewables?
Okay. If there are no other questions, we will call it a day at that. We're a little bit over time, but it's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm grateful to you all for coming along. Thank you very much. And we will now go into private session.